Good afternoon. My name is David Hall, and I would like to thank you for attending today's free online presentation of Lake County Council of Aging Food Safety Webinar. It's presented by Nancy from the Lake County Council of Aging, and we will be muting all participants until after the presentation for the question and answer section. Please be aware background noise during the questions and answers, and self-mute so that all participants can have the best experience. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Ms. Nancy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be talking with everyone today. I want to take a few minutes and talk about home food safety. It's so very, very important, and I'm hoping that everyone will have a little bit of a message to take home and a few practices to improve on. So we'll dive right in. We'll start with talking about why this is so very, very important. The Centers for Disease Control talk about 76 million cases of foodborne illness can occur every year. That's a lot of people being sick. In fact, it's probably, there's probably occasions when a person is sick more than once themselves. Many people are hospitalized, and people even die from food. So it's very, very serious. It's important to is observing good food safety. We're going to talk a little bit about common foodborne illnesses. There are many, many foodborne illnesses, but there's a few of them that might ring a bell with you if we talked about them. I think pretty much everyone is familiar with salmonella, and that's something that we might often talk about in poultry or eggs. Campylobacter is another one. Listeria and E. coli. Those may sound familiar to all of you. The column on the right talks about potential sources where these organisms might be found. And that's the thing about foodborne illnesses. There's different bacteria. Each bacteria may come from a different type of food, and it causes its own special set of symptoms. And those are the kind of things that give public health professionals an opportunity to help figure out what happened when people become sick, from an event or something. So again, looking at the potential sources in the right-hand column, you can see that poultry and meat and eggs all have the potential to have contamination. Some of these things are just inherent in the types of food, and they rely on good handling to keep the numbers of bacteria low, or cooking in order to kill them. You'll notice that unpasteurized milk and dairy products are also listed on there. In Ohio, it's not legal to sell those, although if you're on a farm and you make your own, you certainly can consume them at your own risk. And raw produce is listed everywhere. And that has to do with contamination that could happen maybe in the field due to fertilizing or something to that extent. Foodborne illnesses can occur by either contaminated food or objects carrying organisms into your body. And they grow to the extent that they can really overcome your immune system and cause you to become ill. Bacteria produce very, very quickly. They double. You could start with 1, and then you have 2, and then 4, and then 8, and pretty soon numbers can be into the thousands or millions, and that might be enough to make somebody sick. So contamination, it can happen at the source of the food, like in the field growing. It can happen during processing or packaging. It can also happen during any kind of handling. And it also can happen just by a person being contaminated as well. So when you get a foodborne illness, some of the typical symptoms could be nausea, vomiting, having abdominal cramps, diarrhea, or fever. And again, there's other symptoms, but these are the most common ones. And I think I'll mention right now, a lot of times if somebody has symptoms like that and they're not feeling well, it's really easy to point the finger at the last place where you ate out. Maybe carry out at lunch the day before or dinner the day before. But foodborne illness and sickness can certainly be caused at home. So that's what we'll talk about today, ways that we can prevent them from happening. Who's at risk? Let's take a look at this slide for a few minutes. It's very, very well documented that young children, infants, young children are at increased risk of foodborne illness. They have tiny little bodies. Pregnant women are also at risk. People who are elderly, seniors, they are at risk. And people who have an illness like cancer or a liver disease or something like that where they're immunocompromised as well, or people who are taking chemotherapy or radiation or steroids, they're all at risk. Not to say that somebody who's middle-aged and healthy isn't at risk also, but these people have increased risk. So let's talk about risks that you can control and ways you can minimize the opportunity for foodborne illness. It's very, very important to start with proper refrigeration and storage. And we can even go back a step before that and talk about transportation. On a day like today, when it's 90 degrees, you have to be so very careful when you're purchasing your food at the store and getting it home. You would want to make sure that the grocery store was your last stop. And if at all possible, take an insulated container with you to the store, a refrigerated bag, or even a picnic cooler with some ice or a couple of those freezer packs in there can help to keep the cold things cold. So once you get them at home, you want to make sure that there's good refrigeration temperatures, maybe 40 degrees or less. The cooler your refrigerator is, the longer the food will stay fresh, and it'll help minimize bacterial growth as well. It's a good idea to make sure that you can segregate foods that might leak or drip, like chicken, or sometimes packages of ground beef like to leak from the underneath. You want to make sure that those don't leak on foods that aren't going to be cooked. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. That's what we call cross-contamination. And hygiene is also a way that we can make sure that we minimize the risk of foodborne illness, and that's mostly by having clean hands. And we'll talk about that many, many times throughout this presentation. That's the biggest thing that anyone can do to help assure that their food is safe. And we're also going to talk a little bit more about cooking food properly and reheating, and also putting those leftovers away. We want to talk about ensuring food safety at home. I've mentioned before how very important it is to wash your hands often, and that's the most critical thing. So we're going to wash our hands before we handle any kind of food at all. It's a good thing to start with keeping your kitchen surfaces clean and making sure you start with a fresh cutting board that's nice and clean, so we might want to wash those before we start with food. And then begin by washing produce. You want to make sure that you're not setting your produce into a dirty kitchen sink or something that's had something that could be a contaminant in it earlier. So if your sink isn't real clean or you don't have a lot of space for that, it's a good time to get a colander or strainer or something out so you can put your produce in it before you're going to wash it for cutting and cooking later. While you're working, While you're working, you want to make sure that you keep raw meat separate away from ready-to-eat foods, and keep things in the refrigerator as long as you can. If today, again, we'll use as an example because it's 90 degrees, you're not going to want to pull everything you're going to want to use out of the refrigerator at one time because it's too warm. So just take something out of the refrigerator that you want to prepare or pre-prepare and work with that, and then put it back in the refrigerator until everything you have is prepared and ready to go. So we're going to talk about washing hands now. Effective hand washing is really, really important to help minimize any kind of disease. You want to start with warm soapy water. And the reason for warm water is that people are more likely to wash their hands longer if it's comfortable for them. Ice cold water isn't going to encourage anyone to keep their hands under it for very long. So you want to wash the front and the back of your hands. Make sure you get under your nails really, really well, and even up to your wrists, because sometimes that area could be, close to a bowl or something if we've got our hands in it, or a pan if we're stirring. It's suggested that you want to wash your hands for 20 seconds or sing happy birthday, the happy birthday song or ABCs through twice. That's a good way to encourage kids to wash their hands long enough. Rinse them thoroughly, and here's kind of one of the keys. You want to dry with a paper towel or something that's clean. A common towel or something that's been hanging there in the kitchen and used all week is just going to reintroduce bacteria to your hands. So let's dry hands with something that's fresh and clean, or a paper towel. So now let's talk about when we should wash hands. And I know to some of you this is preaching to the choir, but we're going to go through this anyway and just see if there's something that maybe you don't think about. Definitely you can wash hands before we prepare food and before you eat and before you're feeding children or even an adult that might require some assistance with eating. So you also want to wash hands after handling any kind of raw foods. Think about meat and eggs and fresh fruits and vegetables. Anytime that you switch your tasks too, when you go from one food to another, and you definitely want to wash your hands when you have changed a diaper, use the restroom, help someone else in the restroom, when you've coughed or sneezed, or handled garbage or dirty dishes, touching a cigarette, smoking, using the phone because there can be bacteria on that, playing with a pet, or touching a cut or a sore because there's bacteria in cuts that when you ingest it can cause you to have symptoms of foodborne illness also. I mentioned when we start to work in the kitchen that we need to make sure all the surfaces are clean. And even though you're sure that you cleaned everything nicely last night, before you start again today, it's a good idea to give it a wipe down again for many reasons. There could be insects. Everyone's got a fly or two in their house. If there's a mouse loose in the house, they dribble when they walk everywhere and spread bacteria that could make you sick. So it's just a good practice to clean the kitchen surface really well before you begin cooking. So just use some hot soapy water and give everything a wipe down, and make sure that you're beginning with clean dish towels and a clean sponge or dishcloth, 2 for the day. This particular set of slides from Conagra, they suggest sanitizing your sponges periodically in a mild bleach and water solution. I find that eats up my sponges and it kind of disintegrates them, and they're really no good when you do that. So I'm kind of a fan of taking a damp sponge and giving a minute or a minute and a half in the microwave. It gets it nice and hot, kills bacteria in that. It doesn't smell sour anymore, but you have to be so very careful taking it out of the microwave because it's really, really hot. So if you heat it up to get a little life out of your sponge, let it sit there just for a few minutes so it's not too hot when you pick it up. This last bullet point is kind of important about not using a dish towel for multiple jobs. If you've got a dish towel and you use it to dry your hands when you've washed your hands, you don't want to then use it to mop up something yucky that spilled on the countertop, like chicken drippings or blood from some ground beef. You want to keep the towels specific to their use. If they're for drying dishes, then they should be for drying dishes. And if it's for the hands, then it should be for the hands only. And then it's best if you're cleaning up something that's spilled on the counter that you use either a paper towel or a sponge that can be rinsed out and eventually sanitized. So next slide, let's talk about cross-contamination. In a restaurant, this is a huge issue, and we would talk about this a lot if we were talking about a commercial food service, but it's equally important at home. Cross-contamination is when you have raw foods touching or dripping on foods that are already prepared and are ready to eat. Now, ready-to-eat foods can be something like a potato chip that just comes out of a bag ready. It could be a lettuce salad, for example, something that's not going to get any cooking. It could be fruit, maybe a cut up bowl of watermelon, or anything that isn't going to require any further preparation is a ready-to-eat food. So you want to be very, very careful to make sure that raw food doesn't touch those. And sometimes I think we forget and we allow this to happen kind of unknowingly. For example, you wouldn't want to have a piece of raw chicken on a cutting board and maybe be trimming the fat off of it and not clean it thoroughly and then slice a tomato on it, because there could be contamination from the chicken onto the cutting board and then onto either your knife or into the tomato. So you want to make sure that everything is kept separate. And a good reminder for that, again, like I mentioned, was kind of only take one food item out at a time and prepare it or pre-prepare it, whatever you're doing with it, and maybe put it in another container, put it in a bowl, put it back in the refrigerator until you're ready to continue with your preparation. So another slide about cross-contamination. I mentioned earlier, storing the meat somewhere so it can't drip on anything else. You could store it on the bottom shelf of your refrigerator, but you have to be careful if there's drawers below it that have produce in it. So sometimes setting it on a tray or putting it in a bag or even double bagging to make sure it doesn't drip is a good idea. So you want to wash all produce. There's even a recommendation to wash produce that is labeled as pre-washed or ready to eat, especially if you're in one of those high-risk classes. You know, if you're elderly or a pregnant woman or someone who might be immunocompromised, like a small person. It doesn't hurt to give it a rinse again and then dry it. Make sure that when you wash your produce, you put it in a clean container or clean Ziploc bag. You don't want to return it to the package that it came from. And here's the big one now that we're in grilling season. You want to make sure that you wash your plates between uses or use separate plates when you're starting with a raw product and then finishing with a cooked product. So when I go out to grill, I take my meat on one plate and I have a second plate or platter ready for when the meat is finished so I can put that on there. Meanwhile, the one with the raw contamination on it goes in the house for washing, so it's out of the way so there's no cross-contamination. You need to be careful sometimes with the tools that you're using too. If you're using tongs on something that's raw, you want to make sure that they get washed before you go to use them to handle food that is cooked. And every now and again, you might find that you need to wear some disposable gloves if you have a cut or a sore. That wouldn't be a bad idea either. help prevent contamination. Maybe in the store, some of you have seen that sometimes cutting boards come in different colors. And they have color-coded ones they use often in restaurants. A certain color for poultry and a certain color for meat, and the green ones are always used for produce. That's something that some people can even do in their own homes to help as a visual reminder to not put produce, for example, or something that's not going to be cooked on a cutting board that had something that could have potential bacterial contamination. Your cutting boards need to make sure that they're in good condition, that they're not cracked or broken in any way, because those little crevices are just opportunities to harbor bacteria. You want to make sure that your cutting boards are put in the dishwasher or that they're washed in hot soapy water. They can even be given a quick dunk after they're clean in a very, very mild bleach and water solution, just like a restaurant would do. It's so very important to cook food to proper temperatures. And as we go through, there will be some charts with some temperatures. You might even want to jot some of them down. I'll tell you in advance so you can get a pen and piece of paper. I'll start by saying that these temperatures aren't arbitrary, and they're a little bit different, whether it's beef or chicken, for example. These temperatures have been determined through science, and it's based on the amount of heat or temperature that food must come to in order to kill the types of bacteria that are generally specific to that type of food. So cooking, as we've discussed, is a great way to kill bacteria that is on food. We encourage people, though, to use a thermometer to know when food is done. You really can't tell when food is cooked right by looking and see if juices are clear, or looking at the color of the meat or how it looks on the outside. Some people think you can touch it and by firmness tell if something is cooked or not. That's really not true. We'd like people to use something that's called a metal stem thermometer. I have a picture of one on my very last slide today. They have a dial about as big as a quarter and a long pointy probe that has the sensors for the temperatures in it. They're available everywhere, at discount stores, at the grocery store, at big box stores, and you can get them for between probably $5 and $7. It's a really, really good investment. They generally read from 0 degrees to 220 degrees. And this is very different than the meat thermometer that you might use to stick into a roast. Looks a little bit like it, but it's different in that it can't go in the oven because the plastic on it will melt. It's something that you stick in, it reads very, very quickly, and on the dial you should be able to see if your food is done or if you need to give it a little more time. If you're going to use a thermometer, it's certainly recommended to make sure it gets cleaned, just like all the other utensils that you're using for the day. This slide talks about how you would go about taking the food temperatures. I described this thermometer. It's about the length of a pen, but it's pointy at the very end. You're supposed to poke it into the food. So you want to put it into the thickest part of meat. So it's not touching the bottom of the pan, though. Don't go all the way through it. And keep it away from bone and fat and gristle, because they heat a little bit differently than the muscle part of the meat. So in something like a chicken or a turkey, you want to make sure that you stick it in a very, very dense part of the bird, like in the thigh. Ground meat, you want to make sure that you stick it into the middle of a thick part of the patty. And everything else, just try to get in the middle, not on the edge, because the edges heat up high first. The next few charts will get to be kind of specific to the types of food that you may be cooking, and it'll give you some guidance on what you could do. Ground meat if you're immunocompromised, it's not a good idea to eat undercooked ground meat. If you love to have a rare burger, it's really not a safe thing to do. You should be eating the burgers when they're cooked in the middle to about 160 degrees. The reason that ground meat needs to be cooked to a higher temperature than some other things like a steak, for example, is because of the very nature of how the meat is made. They take whole pieces of meat and put them through the grinder. So any contamination that's there is now mixed all throughout the ground meat. So whereas we might cook a steak and the outside of it gets very, very hot, the inside doesn't need to be quite as hot because the outside is where the contamination would be. But you don't have that opportunity with the ground meat. So again, cook that thoroughly to about 160 degrees if you are concerned with feeding it to a young person, someone who's older, or immunocompromised in any way. This chart is about poultry, and you could see that it's very, very uniform. Poultry across the board needs to be cooked to 165 degrees. And again, that's because of the types of bacteria that are inherent in poultry. That's the temperature that it takes in order to be able to kill them. So there's not really too much discussion about that, and really not much leeway. I don't think anyone's interested in eating any kind of rare poultry of any kind. So the next slide, we'll talk about pork. Take a look at some of these temperatures here. Between 160 and 170 are the recommended temperatures for pork cuts, unless you're talking about a fully cooked ham that you're reheating. Okay, this is pretty straightforward too. But again, you won't know any of these things if you don't have the benefit of a metal stem thermometer in order to take the temperature. Eggs and egg dishes need to be cooked to about 160 degrees also. And leftovers, it's very, very important that leftovers be heated until they're very, very hot. 165 degrees is the recommendation because there's opportunities that bacteria can grow after you've made a food, and maybe it may have sat out for just a few minutes, and then it takes some time to cool, and during which there's an opportunity for bacteria to grow. So it's very, very important if you're going to reuse any of the food to make sure that it's heated up thoroughly, nice and hot, before it's consumed by anyone again. So let's go to the next slide so we can talk about refrigeration a little bit. Refrigerators should be set at 40 degrees or below. I prefer to keep mine more around 37 degrees. We don't want to be freezing any of the produce in the back of the fridge, but the cooler that it is, the faster your food will cool off when you first introduce it to the refrigerator, and the longer it will last. So having said that, this slide is pretty much talking about cooling foods that you've already cooked. So you want to refrigerate within 2 hours, if at all possible. It's a good idea if you have a quantity of food to take it out of the original container and put it in some smaller containers, especially ones that are shallow. It just gives more surface area for the heat to vent off, and it allows the food to cool off that much quicker. Because, for example, if you made a big pot of something in a crock pot, you wouldn't want to take that whole warm crock pot and set it in the refrigerator and expect it to cool off very quickly. The inside would still be warm tomorrow morning if you did it today. So take that out, put it in some shallow pans, some smaller containers to really facilitate the cooling of those food items. It's also a good idea to leave the lid off so that the heat and the steam can escape. When you put food in a container and seal it up tightly and put it in the refrigerator, it takes extra long for it to cool off. And if you have ever taken the lid off of something that you put in the refrigerator and found just a whole bunch of condensation on the lid, that's an indication that it was too warm when you put it in there with the lid on it. So put it in there, even give it a stir if you think about it an hour or so later to bring the warm part up and put the cool part down toward the bottom, and let things get nice and cool before you put the saran wrap or the foil or the lid on the container. Another recommendation, and depending on the food item that you have, it may or may not work for you, but adding ice to foods is one way to chill. A soup, for example, or a sauce, if you can afford to have it a little bit more thin, you could put some ice in it and stir that around, and that will give you a head start on the cooling. Another suggestion that's not on this slide is if you have something that's pretty warm, you can also take a small container with the food in it and set it inside a larger container that has ice in it, and do some stirring and see if that ice can't help you bring the temperature of that food down more quickly. Okay, this chart just shows recommended storage time for leftovers. Really, the more quickly you can eat the food, the better. But it looks like on average 3 to 4 or 5 days is a recommended amount of time for hanging onto your food after you've prepared it or purchased it. And keep in mind, the cooler you keep your refrigerator, the longer you can go. So you might be able to bump that 4 or 5 days just a little bit and get a little bit more life out of your food before you've eaten it all, because we're about finished here. So every day before every meal, you want, just as a recap, to make sure you've washed your hands. Wash the hands of people, little people who can't do it themselves. So babies and small children, you need to get their hands washed and wiped too. Good idea to kind of mop up their faces as well and get the dirt off. And we're going to always remember to keep the raw meats and foods that are ready to eat separate from each other. Use a metal stem thermometer to cook food to the proper temperatures, and then make sure that we refrigerate food promptly in a cool environment, about 40 degrees or less, to help slow down any bacterial growth. These are some other resources, and this is where the information on these slides made by ConAgra was obtained, and it refers to a study even in there. For more information, the OSU Extension always has information for home food safety, and if you have questions, sometimes your local health department is able to help with those questions as well.
Thank you all for your participating in this free online presentation. If you have any further questions, you can contact Nancy, the University Hospitals Ahuja Medical Center at uhahuja.org, or call in at 216-593-5500. This concludes today's presentation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.